With us, the co-director of Futures Economy Scotland and former SNP advisor Miriam Brett, political commentator Bernard Ponsonby, and the businesswoman and entrepreneur Marie Macklin. Now let's start where we started the programme. Marie, what do you make of the winter fuel allowance row?
I think there'll be a lot of unhappy Labour MPs tonight in Scotland calling. These MPs weren't elected to deduct £1.5 billion from our hard-hit pensioners at the best of times. But I think for me the bigger question is, why are we in this situation and how do we get out of this situation? For me, if you look back to 2020 and the COVID epidemic, we've spent £410 billion on COVID measures. And if we sit here tonight, there's £7.3 billion at stake from bounce-back loans that are actually uncollectible. It's about time there was a wake-up call here. There needs to be more robust, long-term government thinking, policy calling.
Bernard, there's a lot of political fallout from this, a lot of pressure on a lot of new MPs.
Absolutely. I mean, the case that they're essentially making is this. We've got £22 billion to find. With this measure, we'll save £1.4 billion. Now, in the grand scheme of things, £1.4 billion in terms of overall public expenditure is frankly loose change. But the political fallout for this, for the government, I think will be quite severe. They say that everybody on universal credit is going to, and pension credit will be protected. But there are 800,000 people in the UK who are entitled to pension credit at the moment and who don't actually claim it. So I think that the real problem is, it's all right saying that there are pensioners, pretty wealthy pensioners, who don't need this money. There are many who are in the middle, probably well over 1 million pensioners who need this money to make ends meet. And given that it is loose change in public expenditure terms, the government are inviting upon themselves an anti-pensioner narrative, which the right-wing newspapers are now beating a drum for.
Miriam, do you think that because they're not on pensioners' credit, do you think they can afford this? 860,000 in Scotland?
No. So just now, we're obviously facing a pretty unprecedented set of crises. We've got still very high inflation rates. We have a massive cost of living crisis that's putting huge pressure on households. We've seen fuel poverty skyrocket, and now we see an increase to the energy price cap. So we've got a series of kind of a perfect storm, if you like, of crises for households. And it's obviously disproportionately hitting those who are poorest, but it's also hitting others as well because of the scale of this crisis. And so moving forward, I think we need to recognise this is a political choice and not a necessity. To reverse the decision to end the universal fuel allowance, but also to more broadly take a step back just now and recognise what's stemming from the energy bill crisis. You know, what this has done has highlighted the cost and volatility of our continued reliance on fossil fuels and the need to transition to a green economy, and also take measures to address household bills through retrofitting homes, which can immediately lower household bills but also reduce emissions and create jobs the length and breadth of the country.
Because fuel bills are going up.
Fuel bills are rising.
And pensioners are going to be frozen out even if this debate is all political.
It's further than that, Colin. This stems back to, you have this situation on the energy crisis, but we also have this housing crisis that's ongoing. And this housing crisis didn't just start yesterday. This has been decades of ill-informed policy from 1997, when we had 4 million council houses, and at the end of 13 years of the Labour government, that was halved. We then have this boom and bust economy in 2008, where we are going to have the land of milk and honey through the buy-to-let market with small investors, and then we have a crash. It's about time there was a wake-up call in Scottish politics and said, what policies can we put in place that's going to put safe in the hands of our pensioners?
Well, this is a UK one, but I'm going to turn to the Scottish ones now, because the big row in the Scottish Parliament this week is going to be over free school meals. Every P1 to P5 child gets the chance of a free school meal. It was due to be rolled out to every P6 and P7 by the end of this Parliament, but the Scottish Government has pulled back on that. It's now just going to go to those on the Scottish Child Payment. Bernard, is this a bit like the winter fuel row for the SNP?
Well, you could say that if you're saying that Rachel Reeves is withdrawing the stuff at Westminster in order to save 1.4 billion because there's a 22 billion black hole. What has now been visited on the Scottish Government is the politics of hard choices. Now, I think the problem that the SNP have got themselves in is the management of the Scottish budget in the last year. If you pass a budget which assumes that pay in the public sector is going to rise by 3%, and you sign off on unfunded pay increases well above that, it's not a surprise that you have to come back and make emergency cuts. Now, I don't criticise the Scottish Government whatsoever for funding these pay increases. I don't do that at all. In a cost of living situation, I think the government are to be applauded. But what the Scottish Fiscal Commission quite properly pointed out last week was that if you don't plan for this kind of expenditure, if you bake into your budget assumptions that it's 3% and you sign off on a whole series of claims which are north of 3%, you have to find the money from somewhere. It's not good management of the budget to sign off on things which are not properly funded. And I would suggest for the Scottish Government, the kind of announcements that we got last week, we're going to be visiting this again and again and again. And the key date, you know, for the Scottish Government wasn't the two statements to Parliament last week. It was the 30th of October, because once we know the direction, the fiscal travel that the new government in London will know, we will know whether or not the SNP government in Scotland have any fiscal manoeuvrability to allow John Swinney to try and make some new policy choices ahead of the election in 2026.
Miriam, this was an SNP manifesto commitment. Are they getting it wrong in government now?
I think when we look back since the creation of devolution at some of the policies that politicians are most proud of, it's often those rooted in universalism. It's tuition fees, it's prescription charges, it's the introduction of the baby box. And there is faults that come with a targeted approach. It can be flawed, it can let people fall through the cracks, and it can create uneven power relations between people. The Scottish Government is obviously facing intense fiscal constraints, and there's been a lot of back and forth about who's to blame for that. The reality is that it's quite nuanced, which I know is not welcome in politics a lot of the time, but the UK's fiscal constraints have impacted Scotland's public finances, and the Scottish Government is not powerless to try and remedy this. A brief cursory glance at the last decade will show us that we cannot cut our way to a more prosperous, greener, fairer economy, and so we need to look at revenue-raising options to rebalance this.
We've just heard some proposals for council reform. Marie, how much is council reform needed in Scotland?
This council reform question has been going on for a number of years, Colin, and I believe in bottom-up growth. And when you look at the COVID epidemic, it was the councils, the hard-working public servants that got us through that crisis. I think it's about time we actually looked at what's happening in the Scottish Parliament. What's happening when we've got MSPs awarding themselves 6.7% increases, £72,000 salary and £30,000 tax-free when they exit. So rather than this constant barrage at councils that they need to cut, it's about time that the Scottish Parliament had a look at, is the Scottish Parliament actually needing reformed, Colin?
So you think 25 years on it should be reformed? That's where we should be starting rather than the councils?
I do. When you have a business, we have to review our business plans ongoing to survive.
Miriam, you're a Shetlander, one of the smallest councils in Scotland. Is small best?
Of course. We are across Scotland as a whole. We have very, very large councils. And I think it's very difficult to be local when they are so colossal in their size and scale. Councils have also faced a period of drastic austerity, which has undermined their capacity, and it's often fallen on communities to try and fill in those gaps. So there's an opportunity here to reinvigorate devolution throughout Scotland by reinvigorating our local democracies.
Miriam says small is best. You think bigger's better though, don't you, Bernard?
But there are two distinct issues here. One is the way in which councils, even large councils, allow communities to feed into the decision-making process. You can, for example, when with the 8 regional authorities in Scotland, you had a position of area management committees where certain functions were devolved to local groups within the regions. One of the problems that I think that you have is that you're asking councils to do things, for example, in the future for social care and all the rest of it, and yet what the current system doesn't give you is economies of scale. You can only get economies of scale if you have bigger units, in my view.
Thank you all for joining us on Scotland Tonight.